Welcome back to Exegetical Tools Basic Greek videos. In this video we're looking at the perfect active indicative, and likely by this point you should have gone through probably all the other tense stems, present, imperfect, aorist, future, and now we're at the perfect. This is usually the last one you look at. There is the pluperfect as well, but that's a little more rare. We will look at that, but this is kind of a major tense stem. It occurs pretty frequently. But it's also one of the more distinctive ones, so if you're worried about memorizing yet another paradigm, don't be too worried about this one because it's actually not that difficult. That reduplication at the beginning is very distinctive and easy to spot usually. There are quite a few rules for the reduplication that we'll look at, but once you get those down and you're able to, especially that the kappa tense formative with the alpha connecting vowels, it's very distinctive in its form. So there's 5 constituent parts here for the perfect active indicative. First of all, there's the reduplication. We'll talk about that. It's usually that first consonant of the stem reduplicated and then an epsilon put after it. So for luo, you get leluka. And then you get the perfect active tense stem, which is kind of its own stem. And the perfect active is the fourth principal part. The perfect middle or passive form is the 5th principal part. So if you need to go figure out what the stem of a verb is, either go to a lexicon and just look and see what it says, see if it gives you the form for the perfect active, or go to a grammar or something like Metzger's lexical aids, go to the principal parts list, and then it should show most of the major verbs that are kind of irregular, and it'll give you the principal parts. You look at the 4th one, you can get the stem from there. Now there's also a tense formative, which is kappa, that tips you off that this is going to be perfect. And then there's also an alpha connecting vowel, so it's not the omicron epsilon variable connecting vowel, it's alpha. Now that's going to look like the first aorist, but in the first aorist, remember the tense formative is sigma, so you get sigma alpha, and that is different than what we have here. But it's these both have alpha connecting vowels. And then we have the primary active personal endings. It's not secondary. It can seem a little counterintuitive because in English we say something like "I have eaten," and that refers to a fact that in the past I ate, and perhaps the result of having eaten are still in effect. I'm still full or whatever. So we would tend to associate the perfect tense stem in Greek with the secondary personal endings, the more past tense oriented endings, but they're not. They use the primary active personal endings. There's probably some reasons for that, but there's no need to go into that. Just remember it's the primary active. Now, as far as verbal aspect, this is hopefully a short video, and so I can only talk for a minute about this, but it's debatable what the aspect is of the perfect tense stem. Remember, you have perfective aspect for the aorist tense, and then you have the imperfective aspect for the present, the imperfect. And now we're at the perfect. There's different views on this. Traditionally, it's been handled as an Aktionsart with Aktionsart categories, which means Aktionsart is the objective event in itself, the way it actually occurred in space and time. So if that, for example, you can see these 2 little diagrams here. The action is presented as either a complete action in the past with enduring effects until the present. So that would be like he has been raised in 1 Corinthians 15:4. That is, he was raised in the past and he still is raised. Or it could be presented as an action with an enduring past, which result in a present state. Something like, I have fought the good fight. So he's continually fought, and now he's in this present state of having fought the good fight. It could also occasionally be used to signify a duration of successive events from the past up to the present time. So something like 2 Corinthians 12:17, I have sinned at various times, would be a way you could translate that. A lot of grammars still work with this kind of traditional view because of the aspect discussion, which is still in flux. Further research, it's going to be a while probably before the dust settles on how we're actually supposed to take the perfect tense, what the aspect is. For now, it's okay if you want to work with the traditional view, but the various positions are that the aspect is stative, and so it refers only to the present state or just simply the state of an action. And then another view is that it's basically like imperfective aspect, but with heightened proximity. So rather than being, given the parade analogy, rather than being on the side of the parade, you're basically in the parade. It's much, it's swirling around you. It's heightened proximity to the event, spatially represented. There's some other views, but those are essentially the two views. What's going on here with these three different views? These are Actionsart categories. So these are talking about the way the action actually happened in space-time. But aspect, you should not confuse aspect with Actionsart. Aspect is the way that the speaker is presenting the action. No matter how it actually occurred in space and time, it's how he's presenting it. So it could have been a multitude of successive events, such as I have sent at various times. He could have sent 20 different letters. But you could represent that action with the perfect tense stem or with the aorist tense stem. You could say I sent letters, and if you said I sent letters, that means you sent 20 letters, perhaps in reality, but you're presenting it as one holistic event. I sent letters. You're not giving many details about how many it was, just the simple fact of the event. I sent them. So that's how aspect works. You can represent the same action with different perspectives. And so with the perfect, you can choose to work with the traditional view and use these Actionsart categories, or you can wait for the dust to settle. For now, I stick with the view that the perfect tense stem is state of aspect. I think it's tied up with the enduring state, or the author is presenting the action as being in a state. So good examples of the verbs to know. When the verb to know is used, often used in the perfect tense because you either know something or you don't. So it works very well with the state of aspect, and that's probably why it's usually put in the perfect tense. So there's far more to it. You can check out an annotated bibliography on aspect if you'd like, but that's it for now. So our default translation will be something like I have loosed or he has loosed. That would be basically how it corresponds to the way we use the present tense in English. Now, as far as the reduplication rules, let's talk about that for a moment. The perfect reduplicates the first letter of the stem. We've already seen that, so just like up top, you have lelucamen. So the lambda, which is the first letter of the stem, reduplicates before it, and then if it's a single consonant, now there's 5 rules here. The first is that if the stem begins with a single consonant, like luo, then that consonant is reduplicated followed by an epsilon. So that's the typical case. If the stem begins with an aspirate consonant, like phi, chi, or theta, it's reduplicated as its corresponding voiceless consonant. So basically, aspirate means you're sending breath through as you say it. Phi, chi, theta, so you're sending air through to make the noise. So it's hard to reduplicate that like fef or something like thethithimi, something like that. It would sound very silly. So what it does is it takes the corresponding consonant that does not have the breathiness to it. So for the phi, it would be p, the chi, it's ki, and for the theta, it's tau. So if you had something like thelo, it would not do this. That's what it would not do. What it would do is the corresponding like that. Of course, this would be different because it would all be in the perfect. It would change according to the morphology of the perfect tense. But this would be the reduplication, like that. Okay, the third rule. The third rule is that if the stem begins with 2 consonants, the verb is usually going to reduplicate a vowel. So when you get to, now we're talking about the perfect stem, not the present tense stem. So right here you have gnosko, which means I know. That's the present tense form. the present active stem is gno, like this. Notice how it's got two consonants, gamma and nu, standing together. So in order to reduplicate that, it's simply going to reduplicate an epsilon out of the front. So you get egnoka, like that. So it's not going to reduplicate the gno part, just it's going to stick an epsilon out front. If the second consonant is a lambda or a rho, the verb's going to reduplicate normally. So grapho is a good example, and then gegrapha. You have that gamma rho, and then before it, the gamma reduplicates, and you get an epsilon. So gegrapha. That's how it reduplicates. The fourth rule is that if the stem begins with a vowel or a diphthong, the vowel is going to lengthen. So here's a good example with agapao. See that first vowel lengthened. You don't have a reduplication of the ag. You just have the lengthening of the first vowel. And diphthongs often do not reduplicate. So here you see the hu from heurisco stays as heureka. And one other thing to note, this last point here, which goes with, as an example, agapao is an example of this. If you have a contract verb like agapao, it's a contract verb because the last letter of the stem is a vowel. Then it's alpha or omicron or epsilon. Then that vowel is going to lengthen whenever you get the kappa tense formative placed in front of it. So instead of egapaka, you get egapeka. So see how this epsilon, that eta is there. That's the lengthened form of the alpha. The last rule is that if you have a compound verb, you're still going to have the reduplication, but the reduplication is going to come after the prefix. So here you have ek balo to cast out, and then you still have ek, and then you have be bleka. So ble is the stem, perfect active tense stem, and then you get the ka ending, and then right here the beta reduplicates with the epsilon, and then you still have ek on the beginning of it. So that's how that works. Yes, okay, so those are the 5 rules. I don't assume that you're going to just memorize them right now. So you'll probably want to refer back to this several times. Anytime you see a perfect tense verb in use, you might want to refer back to these 5 points and just say, okay, is one of these 5 things happening here with this reduplication? That way, every time you see it, you're reminding yourself of what happens with different kinds of verbs. Okay, so let's go down. Let's look at the actual paradigm now. This is the paradigm. So there are a lot of rules to the reduplication, but once you get to the paradigm, it's actually not that scary. As we said, there's the reduplication, which is le for luo all the way down. The stem, which happens to be luo, but remember with something like balo, the stem will be completely different, like ble. So it can be quite different, but for luo, it's just lu. The tense formative is cap all the way down. The connecting vowel, alpha, all the way down. And then all you have here are the personal endings. These are the primary actives. So remember, these are the same exact endings that are being used with the present active indicative. Luo, lues, lue, luomen, luete, and luusi. Now, you're going to have slightly different... you're going to have one different thing going on here. Or two different things, rather. Notice that the third person singular is alpha, connecting vowel, but in the final form, that changes to epsilon. That's the same thing that happens with the first aorist indicative, active indicative. You have elusa, elusos, eluse, or elusen. So if this were still alpha, if that did not change, there'd be no way to tell it apart from the first person singular form. So I'm not sure if that's why the change occurred. There is a pretty complex explanation for why it occurred, but that doesn't matter for you. The fact is it does show up as epsilon, so that epsilon with the movable nu is a very distinctive third-person singular ending. The last thing is that you have unsi as the third-person plural personal ending down there. But whenever it gets stuck on here, now remember with present active indicative, you have luusi. That's the final form like this. and with the movable nu. Where that comes from, there's a bunch of changes that occur, but remember it's initially luonsi, and then that nu does not like to sit in between the connecting vowel and a sigma, and so what it does, it drops out and you're left with luasi, and then to compensate for the loss of that nu, you get the omicron lengthens and you get luusi, and then you add the movable nu. So that's what happens there. But in this case, because you don't have an omicron connecting vowel, but you have an alpha, there's not going to be a lengthening to a diphthong. It's just going to remain alpha. And so the nu still drops out. There would have been a nu right there, lelucancy, but instead it just remains lelucacy. Yes, and then the translation, we just have a standard, like I said, I have a standard translation there. So the first person singular is translated I have loosed, and then you have loosed, he has loosed. That basically corresponds with the English use of the perfect tense, and it's not necessarily how you're going to translate every perfect verb. In fact, many perfect verbs are better translated as simply present tense verbs. So something like if you had an example of something like the verb to know, something like Jesus had known that Jesus has known them, or something like that. It might be better to translate that as Jesus knows them, to emphasize he's in the state of knowing them, the people, whoever it is. So I'm just making up an example off the top of my head, but often you're going to have an English often a present tense English translation will do better to emphasize the state of the event rather than something like I have loosed, which throws you back into the past to point to an event that happened previously. But in any case, however you handle the translation, this is an okay default translation for learning it. So before we quit here, we can say the final forms out loud, and then practice writing them down. Use the principal part leluca as a vocab word if you want to. Stick it in your vocab, so that way you can know it, because if you know that, you can likely build the rest of it from it. So let's say them here. You can say it with me if you like. Leluca, lelucas, leluken, lelucamen, lelucata, lelucasi, or lelucasin. So that is it. That's the perfect active indicative. Hope this was helpful, and practice that paradigm.